Well, again, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 3 of DreamHack. Everybody having fun?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to dive into a little bit of an educational topic that I hope and trust will apply to a lot of people in the room, particularly if you are in the business of content creation, game development, then this panel is for you. And I'd like to first acknowledge that about a third of this room is my family, so thank you guys for being here too, being part of the conversation. Welcome to the panel presented by Arnall Golden Gregory, which is a law firm here in Atlanta that I co-chair the sports and entertainment division of. I have members of my team here, and then we have our very special guest who you'll meet in a moment. We are here to talk about intellectual property in content creation and game development. So buckle up, we're going to talk about a lot of important legal concepts for you as a game developer, but we're going to try to keep it at a level that everybody in this room can understand. This is really just kind of a summary, a little taste of the work that we do so that we can start to shed some light on some topics that tend to be behind a little bit of gatekeeping. We want to bust this gate wide open, okay? So save some questions for the end. My goal is to pace this in a way that we can answer some questions at the end. But rest assured, even when they kick us out of this room, the lawyers up here promise to stick around and we can have some one-on-one conversations with you even after the panel. So the first thing I'd like to do is just do some brief introductions so you know who we are, in our role in the creation of intellectual property. My name is Beth Moore. Again, I co-chair the entertainment and sports team at Arnall Golden Gregory. I have been working with artists and creative entrepreneurs for 12 years, helping them understand concepts of copyright, trademark, understand how important contracts are when you're creating intellectual property, particularly within a team, and then understanding the life cycle of the economy within the entertainment industry, which includes game development, from inception to production to distribution, and hopefully you get to make a little money along the way. So with that being said, I'm going to ask everyone down the line, just give about a 30-second introduction.
Start? Sure. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Davis. Thank you so much for spending your Sunday morning with us when there's so many other temptations out there of fun things to do. For me personally, nothing more exciting than talking about copyright. So maybe you will feel the same way after the next hour. As Beth mentioned, I'm an attorney at AGG on the sports and entertainment team. I'm also a tech transactions attorney is what they're calling it. It's essentially I spend a lot of my time drafting, negotiating contracts for people who develop technology, software, license it, provide professional services for supporting that or migrating data, so forth. I've been an attorney for about 8 years and was in the music industry prior to that, and was really drawn to the legal field because of a passion and an interest in how art and technology intersect. So looking forward to talking to you today.
Okay, I'm Evan Spector. I've been, I can't even say hello in 30 seconds. I've been making games for 40 years. My mom cried because she wanted me to be a lawyer, and instead I started making games. But I've always had an interest in law. I was telling these folks I started a law firm with a friend of mine in elementary school, and we had a contract. It was notarized. We tried cases, including one with a kid who attacked another kid with an ice pick. It was crazy. Anyway, I have a strong interest in the law. I love contracts. I think they're like games. I approach them like games. I love bleeding on them, which makes lawyers hate me. And I kind of live on the USPTO search site because it's impossible to trademark anything. And you don't want to get a lawyer involved until you've eliminated the obvious things. So, and I can tell you horror stories about trademark and copyright, which I suspect we'll get to.
Hey everybody, my name is Marcus Jackson. I'm an associate attorney at AGG. I'm with the corporate M&A and sports and entertainment team. Corporate M&A being, hey, we help you set up your business, help you negotiate contracts, help you do those licensing agreements, those publishing agreements that you may need. I'm more the sports side, so that's football, basketball, esports, gaming. Been gaming since I was a little kid. Absolutely love it. I'm excited here to talk about video games. So I'm going to talk to you guys about video games and how that intersects with law and help you guys out there. Prior to that, I was a professional football player with the Detroit Lions. Wasn't like a wide receiver. I was an offensive lineman, as you can tell by the size here. If I was anything smaller, it would have been a bad post-career for me. Prior to that, UT, I know we may have some Georgia people here, but University of Tennessee grad, All-American there. Hey, I see you waving the hand, man. We're both in the same boat this year. We're watching Alabama. But I'm excited to come talk to you guys and, just talk about these games and game development. Hope you get to learn something after this is over with.
Well, let's kick off the learning then. The title of this panel is about intellectual property for content creators and game developers, but even just that term, intellectual property, is a little bit of lawyer speak. Michelle, can you break down what exactly intellectual property is and maybe some examples?
Sure, and I will try to do that and leave some room in the hour for other questions. But intellectual property, I think it helps to just think about property generally first in sort of the broader circle, right? And you think about something that you own, whether it's your laptop, a Nintendo Switch, home. There's value in owning that property, right? You can sell it, you can give it away for free, you get to use it, you could throw it away. And the same is true with intellectual property, except that intellectual property is creative works that may be intangible. And they fall generally under 4 categories is how we look at intellectual property. There are patents, trademarks, copyright, and trade secret. And each title kind of refers to how they're protected under the law and the role that they serve. So a really quick description of each. Patents you've probably heard of. Those protect inventions and also processes and also plants. There's plant patents. I don't think we'll get that deep into it, although there may be certain types of plants that you have an interest in while gaming. That's for a different panel. They also, patent is under the USPTO. It's very tedious and expensive to get a patent. It's a very long process and highly technical. Trademarks protect short phrases. They're basically protecting brand or source identifiers, so the things that tell you where a product or service came from. So think logos, names, slogans, things like that. Copyright.
All right, did everybody get that? 4 types of IP: copyrights, trademarks, patents, trade secrets. They all kind of function differently, but if you're a game developer, you're going to encounter 1, if not 2, possibly 3 of those categories. So, let's focus on the copyright part of that, because I think that is most broadly applicable. As Michelle said, copyright is the body of law that protects creative works. But there is at least one important element of that, is that creative work has to exist somewhere in the world other than just in your mind. Okay? You have to create it. Once it's created in a tangible medium, if it's original enough, it may qualify for protection under copyright. So, for example, with game development, and this is going to lead into our next question for Mr. Spector, Warren, is, think about, I know everybody here has a unique project that they're working on, but generally speaking, most games have elements of copyrightable work embodied within it. It could be, the unique universe that you've created, the storyline, the identity of the characters. It's like they take on their own identity in the sense that they now exist in the world. They have a name, they have, characteristics to them. That could very well be where the copyright within the framework of your video game, that's where it originates. So Warren, I'm not going to ask you a legal question, but can you tee up the framework for what it's like to create intellectual property, starting with the copyright and the storylines and the characters? What is that process like for you?
Well, first of all, it's great creating new IP. I've worked with other people's IP on several occasions, and while that can be exciting, working in someone else's world and trying to find something new in that world is an interesting challenge. But creating something brand new is, I'm sure, what all of you want to do. I will tell you that it is risky. It is hard to convince someone to give you money for something that is untested, and it becomes more and more difficult every year. To actually answer your question, the starting point for a game and for copyrightable aspects of a game, there are so many different places to start. You can start with a character. You can start with a fantasy you want players to live. You can start with a role. You can start with a world. You can start with a game mechanic. All of those can fall under copyright at some point. And you should actually, at some point, make sure that you do deal with a lawyer and you do copyright your work. I've used all of those starting points at one time or another. With Deus Ex, it was a world. I was tired of making fantasy and science fiction games, and I originally called it the real world role-playing game. So the first thing I did was say, okay, what does it mean to set a game in the real world? I quickly realized that was a stupid idea because I couldn't put a telephone on a desk because everybody knows how a telephone works, and I couldn't live up to that expectation. But so the world was my starting point. But then I said, okay, let's think about the character and the fantasy. I want to make a guy who ex-CIA agent Jake Shooter, who retired and got all the jobs that were too tough for the CIA to handle. And then I said, okay, let's make him an augmented agent. Set the game in 2052 because then no one can tell me that's not the way a computer works. Anyway, it went on from there. But I think it's important to know your starting point and develop it kind of like an onion from the inside out. What's your core? Decide that for yourself. And then when you've got your fantasy, your character, your world, your mechanics, because that's an important part. And I've never actually, this is an interesting question, I've never actually copyrighted software, but I believe you can. I know I'm getting off topic, but other side, the company I work for actually has a patent pending. I think we're in year 6 of trying to get it approved, so it does take a while. But again, know your starting point, develop outward from the core, and you've got a new IP that you desperately hope you can find someone to fund.
Thank you. Well, you bring up an excellent point, which is that when you create original intellectual property, you know, not only does that require a lot of work for you as the creator, developer, but it also means you have to convince other people to adopt your vision. So, Marcus, my question to you is, well, what about using a piece of popular work that's already out there that people already know, and then converting that, whatever it is, maybe a comic book, maybe a movie, and then making that into the basis of your video game? At least then you can bridge that gap where people are already familiar with this universe, this character, you know, the general storyline. Well, what is the challenge for game developers if that's the route they want to go?
If that's the route you want to go, I would say your main challenge here for people taking notes, please make sure that you know who owns the IP and you have an agreement with said person for the video game rights. That's what you want, the video game rights to that storyline, to those characters, to the villains. You probably need more than the main characters. You might want to go to the villains too. And what that looks like in real practice, you know, I like the Spider-Man games. I sat in my room and I played Spider-Man games for an extremely long time, so I actually love it. But there was actually a gray area, I think back around like 2015, 2016. What happened was Activision used to make all the Spider-Man video games up until then. Well, then that contract ran out. And so the question becomes, who owns it? And so back then you have a tough time finding it. Well, now we all know it's Marvel. But Marvel didn't want to give those rights over to Insomniac and PlayStation, Sony, who actually done a great job making those games. They have a partnership agreement where they use those games, where Sony gets to be the sole publisher and Insomniac gets to use the rights to develop that game. And so Insomniac had to come together and make a partnership agreement with them. That only happens because they were able to track down the fact that, hey, nobody owns the video game rights anymore, that contract's expired, we gotta go to Marvel and figure this out. And so those are the challenges you're gonna face, is tracking down who owns the IP. Another example of that would be, well, actually, the Star Wars games. The Star Wars Jedi game, I absolutely love it. Anything with sword fights, my thing, so I'm all for it. But that game is owned by, the rights to it, the video game rights, owned by, I think, Disney and Lucasfilm Group. And so to get those rights, you would have to go and approach those people and get those rights. Now, there's no sole agreement with EA anymore. And so if you've been keeping up to date, there's this onslaught of Star Wars games that are about to be developed and released. And so if you want to go that route, you can approach those people and get that done. But you got to make sure, the number one thing here is figure out who owns the IP and get the video game rights for that IP.
Yeah, can I jump in there?
Yes.
I have some experience with that. I worked for Disney for 7 years, and I will say, don't bother approaching me. I'm not big enough to approach them. They actually approached me, which was pretty darn cool. And I got to make a Mickey Mouse game. With that, I had a character, Mickey Mouse, like the most recognizable icon on planet Earth. So I didn't have to worry about ownership. I just had to worry about approvals at every step of the way. And people ask me all the time, were they a tough taskmaster? And the answer is actually no. They said no on only one thing that was so stupid I'm not going to tell you. And I got in a fight with them about that one stupid thing, and I won, which was pretty incredible. But there was no question of ownership. Tell them more Disney stories, that's for sure. The one thing I do want to say, Mark's absolutely right. Make sure you know who owns what. And I will tell you a horror story that's going to bridge to trademark, which I don't know if you want to go there yet. But when I started at a company called Origin Systems, where we made Ultima games, and I got to work on all sorts of other projects, including one called System Shock. And being stupid, I worked with the CEO of Origin to negotiate a deal with the developer of System Shock. So we would own the trademark at Origin. They would own the copyright. And the thinking was that would bind us together forever. And we separated, let's just say. And so for years, that property, it was fallow. No one could do anything with it. And so recently, about 5 years ago, we went to Electronic Arts, which had acquired Origin. Who owns the rights to System Shock? Oh my God. It was EA owned the copyright, and an insurance company owned the trademark, because Looking Glass, that originally owned the trademark, went out of business. We couldn't track down the insurance company. Another company found them and paid them nothing for the trademark. And so we licensed the copyright from EA. This other company owned the trademark, so we had to negotiate with them to call our game System Shock. And they then went off and told the world that they were going to make new System Shock games, which they didn't have the rights to do, because we had a universal in perpetuity right to use the copyrighted material in any way we wanted. So does EA own it? Does universal in perpetuity rights represent ownership? Can someone who owns the trademark do anything with it without, it was a nightmare. Make sure you know who owns what.
Yeah, if you own something, but you grant somebody exclusive rights to it, then who really owns it at that point? That's where the legal language comes in to distinguish. But hopefully you're starting to pick up on a pattern here, which is, again, we're talking about intellectual property. Copyright is one type of property. Trademark is another type of property. And this type of property can be bought, sold, traded, divided, mortgaged. It can be granted to one person for a certain period of time. When that time's up, it goes to another person. This is where legal guidance and well-worded contracts are going to be your best friend. So, Michelle, I want to ask you a question, though. Thinking about our friend Marcus down there who used to play for the Detroit Lions, there are games that incorporate real people into them. Whether it's athletes or I saw the trailer for Grand Theft Auto, and it has like all these Florida Man references in it. What's going on there? Like, what kind of permissions are or are not needed for those types of references in a video game?
Great question. So then we are getting into a new area of law here, which is actually closer to privacy law than intellectual or property law. But you have something called publicity rights, which is something that usually celebrities own. And it's basically the value of your name, image, and likeness. And you own that, and especially if you are in the business of, if you're a celebrity, you might have an exclusive deal to represent, let's say Coca-Cola hires you for their ads, they're going to be very angry if you do another ad for Pepsi, right? And so if you want to use somebody's name, image, or likeness, you have to have a contract and permission with them to make sure you're not running afoul of any exclusive deals that they have, to make sure that they're not going to sue you, that they might want some control in how their image is portrayed, so maybe they don't want to be the bad guy in your game, or that they want to have some control over what the image looks like, some approval. And the same kind of goes for individuals, even if you're not quite a celebrity yet, there would then be kind of invading your privacy by putting your actual image into a game where people interact without your permission, especially if they feel like that's damaging to them in some way. So there's a lot of different caveats, but again, there's a world of permission when you use real human beings or references to them.
Do you think GTA is in trouble for mimicking some people that have been in the news? Like we saw the guy with the tattoos.
Right. Yeah, sometimes I guess there might be exceptions in parody, potentially. There might be fair use exceptions when things are newsworthy. Sometimes you get away with it. It kind of depends on how the image is used. If it's used to sell subscriptions or sales of a game, then that's going to be more publicity rights. If you're saying something bad about them in a context where it's clear that it's not satire, maybe there's some like libel, defamation type claims. But the other side of this is there's a legal world of it, and then there's sort of the business world. And just because you do something that might be towing the line, it's very expensive and time consuming to go after somebody who's infringing or libelous. And so you might, as a game developer, take that business risk and be like, is this person really gonna go after are they gonna find out about this? Are they gonna take the time and money to try to sue me and go after me? Or maybe I'm a big enough game that I have the money to sort of pay them off and settle before it goes too far. So there's sort of what's legal, what's not legal, and then the more practical side of how those conflicts resolve.
I'm not a conservative developer, but as a business matter, I would not try to use something that might get you sued. Wow. No, I created 3 original IP at Junction Point that was part of the value to Disney of the acquisition of that studio. And when I left Disney, I went to legal and said, and the business people, I want those properties back. I created them. You're not going to do anything with them. And they flat out refused, even though they weren't going to do anything. And I every 6 months I would contact them. I had a friend in legal, and I'd say, look, I'll buy them back from you. He would always say, no. His bosses wouldn't let him. And finally, he got laid off, like everybody at Disney eventually does. Did I say that? I love Disney. I would go back again anytime. Actually, that's true. Anyway, he had been laid off, and what he told me, there was one in particular, and he said, just make the game. No one's going to notice that. They're not going to sue you because they won't know. They won't even know they own it. And I just said, a lawyer told me that? No, I'm not going there.
Smart man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our default position to our clients when dealing with these matters is it's better to get permission, because it's also, as much as it is expensive for you personally to go after someone with a claim of libel or copyright infringement, it's also very expensive to defend yourself against those claims. So you really got to balance that out and figure out what your strategy is going to be.
Yeah, actually, I'm sorry, I told you I was going to talk. When IDOS acquired IonStorm, they did some stuff that was, I loved working for IDOS too, and that's genuinely true. But in the acquisition, they did some stuff that was just pretty strange, and I wasn't thrilled about it. So I talked to my lawyer, and he said, you know, do you like working with them? And I said, yeah, I do, actually. And he said, then just don't worry about it. You know, so that was how I got involved with IDOS. It's a lot about relationships. Do you trust people? Do you like working with them? Are you willing to make compromises? I did the same thing with Disney. When Disney acquired Junction Point, they said they were going to make the announcement at E3. They had a room. They invited all the journalists. The journalists were filing in for the announcement. They didn't know what the announcement was, but they knew there was going to be an announcement. And I was outside the room with the guy who ran Disney Interactive, not having signed the contract yet. And I had a lawyer on one phone on this year, and I had my agent on this year on another phone, and we were going through the last point. And my agent said the same thing. Do you like working with these guys? You know, go ahead and sign it. So I signed it on the back of the guy who ran Disney Interactive, and went in and we made the announcement to a room full of journalists who almost got really disappointed. So, you know, again, a lot of it is relationships. It's not always, don't listen to this, it's not always the law. It's a lot about relationships.
Yeah, when you go to see an attorney, they will usually they will give you the risks, right? They'll say, if you do this, this could happen. If you do this, this could happen. And then ultimately, it's the business that's going to decide which route and what their priorities in that relationship are.
And I completely agree with Warren, even as an attorney, that you can have the most objectively perfect contract, but if the person who you're in that contract with is not able or willing to uphold their obligations under the contract, then the contract's worthless. So be careful who you choose to do business with. And Marcus, speaking of relationships, you know, let's say you've got a game developer who, you know, has a concept for a game developed, you know, in terms of, you know, what they want the universe to look like, the storyline, the characters. But we all need help, right? We all need to build a team to make something bigger than what we can create on our own. So Marcus, what advice would you have for a game developer who is looking to bring on team members, maybe as employees or maybe as freelancers? What should that developer think about in terms of how they engage with that team?
I think the most important thing here is going to be who owns the IP or the works that was created on your behalf. So that would be in the independent contractor agreement. You have something called a work for hire clause in there. Now the work for hire clause is getting kind of technical, but basically all it means is anything you created while on this project for me, I own it. You created it for me and I own the intellectual property rights for it. If you have an employee, you're going to want to make them sign what's called a work for hire agreement. It's not going to be actually in the contract. It's going to be some separate agreement that, hey, anything you created is owned by the company. I think that's number one. Number two, I would say, would probably be some form of confidentiality, NDA. You don't want to create something really cool and slick and, you know, game changing, and then somebody runs over and they tell everybody about it. And so that your competitor now has a chance to copy and implement it and possibly get out the market before you can. So I think that's the second thing too as well. And I also think as far as three as agreements go, you're probably going to want to figure out how you're going to want to publish that game. You know, you want an exclusive deal with somebody like a Sony, I think like Spider-Man and Sony's exclusive deal. Remember Halo, Xbox exclusive. You're going to want to figure those things out as well.
Michelle, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, actually, so I think those are all the right sort of contracting documents, but also I think it's important to think about what happens if you don't have those contract documents, so what that looks like. So there are defaults in how ownership is sort of reviewed. And if you have more than two or more people creating a work together, that's known under copyright law as a joint authorship. And the default is that you all equally own rights to that work. And to anyone who's ever worked on any group project ever, you know that the responsibilities not necessarily fall equally on everybody's shoulders, right? And so you can imagine the frustration if you've got a game 90% done, you pull in someone to help you with one little piece, and then they're asking for 50% of the profits from it down the road. So if you don't have a written agreement, it doesn't have to be work for hire, although there are benefits to that, that says, we agree working on this project, this is how we're going to treat our revenue, this is how we're going to treat ownership, then it's going to default. And you might be in an unfortunate position. Work for hire, generally, there's two kinds of work for hire ways that something can be work for hire. One is as an employee doing work for their employer in the course of their employment. It might even be a work for hire provision in your employment agreement when you sign up to work for somebody, a corporation. And as Marcus said, as soon as that work is created, it's owned by the company as opposed to you creating it and then assigning it, giving it to the company. And then the other way is with independent contractors who don't necessarily work full-time for the employer or the company, but they have a written contract and it has to be in writing and it has to explicitly say this is work for hire, and the product that they're making has to fall under, there's a list under copyright law of the kinds of works that are allowed to be work for hire. And so it actually can get pretty detailed and very fact specific on how that's enforceable. And if it's not work for hire, under copyright law, after 35 years, if you've assigned your rights to someone and said, I give you exclusive license to use what I've created, you can actually get that rights back. And 35 years seems like could be a long time, but when you think about how long, something like Mickey Mouse or these famous trademarks and copyrights can last, some of them grow in value over that time. With work for hire, there's no takesy-backsies, as lawyers say. And so you kind of have those rights forever. And in order to do that in a nice, clean, formal way, forming a business so that if you don't already have one, so the LLC or the corporation owns those copyrights, is much cleaner. It helps you get investors when you say, it's not, Steve and Laura and Beth and Michelle are all kind of own this and they're fighting about it. It's, Beth Inc. owns this, and you can deal directly with them. It just cleans up the licensing moving forward.
Make sure you've got work for hire agreements that hold water too. I've been in a situation where an artist said his work for hire contract didn't clearly call out what it needed to call out, and he sued the company, and I had to do all sorts of depositions, and we won, but it was very unpleasant. So make sure you get those things right.
Warren, I want to ask you a question that expands upon one of the points that Michelle just brought up, which is kind of funneling all of these properties, these intellectual properties, into one main source that makes it easy for licensees, distributors to be able to engage with this IP. So can you tell us a little bit about how you manage, how you administer, how you own your IP? Do you do it through some kind of LLC?
Yeah, I've done some startups, and other side I was a co-partner, and there are a bunch of different kinds of corporations that you folks could, S corps and C corps and LLCs and all that. LLC is the one that makes the most sense for most startups. So that's what we started, and it was pretty straightforward. The process isn't ridiculous, and so that's the way we went. The companies I've started to own the IP, not me personally, not my partner personally. I know some examples of that, but mostly it's a corporation that owns trademark and copyright, and that's probably the way you want to do it. Even when you're small. Other side started out as me and him. And we immediately set up our corporation because there are tax ramifications, there are property ramifications. So you probably, if you're really in this for, it's not just a hobby for you. If it's a job, if it's a business, if it's your future, you want to look into probably an LLC. And if you can't tell already, you can do a lot of this on your own. There are all sorts of packages for that give you paperwork and everything. don't depend on them. I mean, I know lawyers are expensive, but they're not evil, and they're useful, and no, my sister was a lawyer. I mean, what I discovered was lawyers are great. I love talking to lawyers, and
Give them the money back.
I'll tell you another story. My cousin is a lawyer at a big deal New York law firm. He's a partner, and there was one time when I was selling a studio. He said, and again, there are always going to be issues in contracts. You're never going to get a perfect contract. And he said, again, do you like working with these guys? And I said, yes. And he said, don't fight these little clauses that are concerning you. They have more money and lawyers than you do. Even if you end up winning, do you really want to end up in court for 5 years? So find good lawyers who can help you make it, but don't depend on the package you can buy at CVS.
Excellent. Well, Marcus, you're a corporate lawyer. You deal with corporate formation and governing documents and all of that. What advice do you have for the game developers in our audience? Maybe you've got a couple of friends that just got together one day and started making a game, and then it just kind of evolved, and now it's getting to the point where maybe they could actually make some money off of this. Well, what advice would you give them if they have not started their LLC or corporate entity?
If they haven't started a business, I would say you need to start one with corporate veil protection. Now, that just means, hey, if the business becomes liable for something, you won't be personally liable for it. It can't go over your personal assets. That's very, very important. Otherwise, the things that you own, like your car, your house, can be up for grabs. And the way to protect that best, as he said, in most situations, is an LLC. LLCs are really, really flexible, especially when it comes to IP ownership, which is going to be a big deal, especially for game developers. The IP flows relatively directly in between the members, and the members are just the people who own the LLC. There's something more that Michelle can talk to you about too, which is an IP holding company setup, and that's where you assign all your IP to an LLC, and then you would license that out to your company. That gets a little complicated here, so I'm gonna let Michelle try to boil that down for you.
I've never heard of that. That's interesting.
Well, and as part of your answer, can you also just remind folks what LLC stands for?
A limited liability company. And I'll say, so you register for an LLC in a specific state, and in Georgia, it's super easy and relatively cheap to get an LLC. That's not true everywhere. So, and in particular, I know it's a real pain to get an LLC in New York, because I had a client that tried to do that. It's very expensive. You have to, I don't remember, there's many more hoops to jump through. So you have to take that into consideration. All you need to actually get the LLC is an address in Georgia, and I think $100. So, but for your LLC to be successful, you then need to back that up with an operating agreement, a contract that says how that company is going to run. But so in terms of holding companies, this actually exists in a lot of different creative worlds. So we represent touring artists and a lot of performing artists, recording artists, producers have holding companies as well. It's basically the entity that is signing the contracts when intellectual property is licensed. So you personally would have an agreement that they're the owners, and that's it just helps clean up the contract negotiation, essentially. I think that's the fastest way to talk about it.
Yeah, so you file your LLC with the Georgia Secretary of State. That way you're on your way to being able to get an employer identification number, set up a bank account, start, dealing with your intellectual property through that bank account in terms of what you expend, what you take in. But then what Michelle's talking about in terms of an operating agreement, think of that as like a governing document for how you and your partners are going to operate the business. Who gets to own it and in what percentage? How are decisions made for the company? Is there going to be a voting mechanism whereby, there's a certain number of votes, depending on how many members, that majority gets to decide how the company moves forward? What happens if and when the company eventually dissolves? right? Because no company lasts forever. They're kind of, well, some do. But they're mostly designed to serve a certain purpose for a certain period of time. And then there has to be an agreement as to how it's going to be dissolved. What if one of the partners wants to give their shares away or sell it or, give it back to the other members? Well, there's a process for that. Including a process for what if, God forbid, somebody in the business dies? What happens to their shares? Does it go to their spouse? Does it go back to the other partners? Well, all of that has to be in writing, and that's what we call an operating agreement for a limited liability company.
You have no idea how important that is. Okay. In a sense, that may be, no, that's not the most important. Copyright and trademark are the things that are going to affect you the most. But I worked for a company, which I will not name, that had 4 partners. And the employment agreement did not have anything about what happens if there's a tie on a business decision. 2-2, we were screwed, okay? 2 of the partners, let's just say they underperformed, and we'll leave it at that. There was nothing in the agreement that said how people could be ushered out the door. They eventually got paid a lot of money to leave. So make sure you get your paperwork right.
Very good. We're going to cover one more major topic before we open it up to Q&A, and Michelle, this is squarely for you. This is about music. Now, in my experience, just about every video game that I encountered has some form of music involved. There's some great developers here in the indie playground that have made music kind of a central component of their game, which I personally love, because I'm a music fanatic. But for any game, there's even maybe just some white noise music going on in the background that was probably carefully curated to, keep your attention going, right? Anyway, music is one copyrightable component of a larger ecosystem involved in one game. So, Michelle, can you tell the audience here, who may not be terribly familiar with music copyrights and how the music industry operates, what advice do you have for them when thinking about either licensing pre-existing music or maybe even hiring somebody to create custom music for their game?
So if you want to use a song that's out there already, that's been published, let's say you have like a rock band type game, you want to use the latest, Billie Eilish single, just to think of an artist, you actually have to secure 2 copyrights, and this is where music gets extra confusing. But there's a right in the composition, which is the underlying music and lyrics, and then there is a right in the recording itself. It may be owned by the same person or company, or it could be 2 different entities. So if you think about a cover song, for example, the person who wrote the underlying song or their publishing company would own the rights to the song, and whatever voice you actually hear owns the recording. So there's a million different ways you can go about this. If you want the song that you hear on the radio, in that way you need to go get a particular license to synchronize that music with your video game. You're going to need to get permission from whoever owns the publishing rights, that's the rights to the composition, whoever owns the recording rights, and you're going to get some kind of a license, and that license they're able to detail the scope of that license in many ways. So you have to really make sure that your use of that song is described fully. In other words, if they might give you permission to have that song for 30 seconds in this one scene, but not in any of your ads that are on YouTube for your game. So that's a separate license if you want to use their music in your promotion. If it's going to be a sort of game where they can pick your song, like a Beat Saber or something, and I want to play a game with this song, that's a specific kind of use. Is it going to be in perpetuity? Is there a timeline where you're going to have to make this an exclusive offer for a year or 2 or 5 and then give it up? All those things are kind of controlled by the artist or the publishing company, and because there's 2, this is when it can get a little bit complicated. There's also very often something called a most favored nations clause, which is a weird way of saying that everyone that you have a contract with has to agree to sort of the same terms. So if you have a video game that has lots of songs from different recording artists and there's the most favored nations, provision that would say if I'm paying this person $5,000, I have to pay everybody $5,000. I can't pay you less. Whatever the best deal is, that goes for everybody. On the other side, if you want to hire somebody to make original music for your game, you can have a contractor relationship, or you can have this sort of work for hire premise, which is, as the game owner, ideal, because you want to be able to own it entirely as soon as it's created. And then in that relationship, you usually, as the game developer side, have some more say. Because you can say, I want you to compose music that fits this scene. I might have some rights of approval, say this isn't quite right, redo it, how many times can I say that? It's a different working relationship, but ultimately you have more power as the game producer and developer. And you can also figure out how with the payment scheme it's going to be like. Whether you're composing that as part of your salary job, or is there a flat fee, or is there some sort of a royalty structure where you get back-end benefits for every license.
Warren, you want to jump in?
Oh, yeah, I have experience. You know, in 40 years, you basically have experience with everything. Stick with, like, original music. The legal ramifications of licensing the music you love are dramatic, and you don't want to, I mean, you cannot deal with them by yourself. It is literally not possible for anybody in this room to deal with it. It's super expensive. I mean, in Deus Ex, nobody remembers this, which pisses me off. But I love David Bowie, and his lead guitarist years ago was a guy named Reeves Gabrels, who I also love. And so on Deus Ex, I contracted, a work-for-hire contract, amazingly enough, with Reeves. And he did 4 original tunes for Deus Ex. Like I said, nobody remembers. But it was work-for-hire because he was so psyched about doing music for a video game. So you can find people who are really excited about it. But man, any going after any like real music is stupid expensive. You know, my audio director, I wanted to use a specific song that I won't name because it will reveal something about the game I'm making. But I wanted to use this song, and I talked to my audio director and said, well, you know, what do you think this is going to cost? It's an older song. I don't even know if the band still exists. And he said, well, it could be anywhere from $5,000 to $100,000. You know, it varies. And we checked, and they wanted $50,000 for the use of this song in a trailer. Like, no. I mean, I'm just not going to do it. So my audio director wrote some original music that's great, and everybody's happy. But if you do find, you know, I also work with some folks who worked at Harmonix, and you do not want to know how complicated and expensive the Beatles rock band deal was. Just as a note, okay. I wouldn't even try to describe it, but use original music, make sure it's work for hire and you own it. I mean, frankly, anything you can get away with. Work for hire can be perceived by people who work on a game as kind of scummy. You know, why shouldn't I own my work? But it's the right thing to do. You know, you pay them a reasonable amount of money so that they're happy. You don't have to worry about ownership. You know, 10 years from now. I mean, I've got games that people are still playing 20, 30 years after they released. I can't worry about you know, an artist or a musician coming to me and saying, you owe me royalties. By the way, speaking of royalties, I am going to say this on camera. There is a movement now for voice actors to get royalties. I will never use an actor who requires a royalty personally. I don't believe that an actor's voice sells a single copy of the game. So there you go. I'm the guy who says stupid things. My wife, when I come home from something like this, says, what did you say that you shouldn't have said? That was it.
Well, freedom to contract, right? So, you know, it all comes down to what you negotiate, what your negotiating leverage is. Right? Okay, so I'm hoping that over the course of the past 50 minutes or so, you guys have come up with some really good questions. We'll try to answer as many we can before the hour's up, and then for those we don't get to, meet us out in the hallway, okay? And young lady in front.